Okay, we're live. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm coming here after about 2 years after IndiaFOSS, and it's great to see the community expand, more people be here. And thank you for the volunteers for organizing this very well. Since I have 15 minutes, I'll pace through this talk. And this talk is actually based on a research paper. It's a working paper I've written with a joint project, which is looking towards what can be the next levels of FOSS policy in India by itself. So what we've heard from Abhishek to some extent has been that there's a broad recognition in India that FOSS by itself is something which is needed for national development. And this is reflected, when I saw that in one of the early conversations between Abdul Kalam and Bill Gates when he's visiting the president's house. And Abdul Kalam basically links FOSS to the essential need for creating public infrastructure, where he says there's a basic difference that FOSS allows us to build something which is not dependent on the business practices which can shift and cause great havoc to people in India. And this recognition in 2001 in this conversation is in fact first carried through into policy, not at the central level, but at the state level in Kerala. And there was also a question on the International Center for FOSS, in which I'll get into more. But essentially what we've seen in Kerala has been that from 2001, there has been a policy push from the state IT policy to 2017, where there have been specific implementation frameworks. So what are these FOSS policies? My submission here is that the FOSS policies which have been made by the government of Kerala or have been made by the central government are essentially inward-looking. They are towards how can we build FOSS inside government? How can we adopt FOSS? Rather than looking at the larger FOSS community or FOSS development by itself, which is happening in India. And even though Kerala has stepped up through the International Center for Free and Open Source Software, one good indication of how execution may be matching a policy document is by knowing that, is it actually using the money which it's been allocated? And if you look at the International Center for Free and Open Source Software, over the last 2 years, and this may be partly due to the pandemic, but as per the state budget, they are not even utilizing half of the amount which they have been allocated. And the International Center for FOSS and the state of Kerala, in fact, are much ahead of any other state in India. 3 or 4 states more do have state IT policies or FOSS policies, but what they do not have is a center for FOSS promotion and budgetary allocation which exists. And even Kerala, which does have it, is not doing that well. Now let's step back and look at what's happening at the central level, what's happening in Delhi, for instance. And prior to the Digital India program, which was launched in August 2014, in 2012 itself, there was an official policy on procurement which said that the government should encourage the adoption of FOSS. And this then flowed down into several policies, several frameworks, and in fact, there was a question that whether there is any framework for adoption for FOSS, and that does exist in India. And that does. So there are certain policies on procurement, adoption of open source software for the government of India. And this is even though the document says it's mandatory, it has large carve-outs. It says that the government can avail certain exemptions. The second is in terms of building, where it needs to make its own software open source. But the larger sense in this room is these policies are actually not resulting in any actions. And why is that? The main fault which we have also identified is that there is also departure from these policies to some extent. If you look at, there's the word open which is used in several government policy documents as well as in Arogya Setu. But it's not completely open source. It's not following the 4 freedoms, right? And this basically comes to institutional capacity. More or less, FOSS implementation is primarily driven out of the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. It has certain arms, such as the National Informatics Center, the National Resource Center for Free and Open Source Software, and the National E-Governance Division. All three of them are situated within one ministry. But when you look at FOSS promotion by itself, it has to be through multiple ministries. For instance, if you're looking at curriculum development, it has to be through the Ministry of Human Resources. If you're looking at procurements or builds which are being done by other central government departments, it also needs to be done by those specific ministries by itself. Everything is not being developed by NIC. And this is why you also have outcomes such as Arogya Setu. One thing which I looked through when I looked at the annual reports of the Ministry of Electronics and IT for the past 3 years is that there is a section on FOSS every year. It has 3 broad themes. First is the adoption of a open source software operating system, which is called BOSS. The second is some disparate training activities which they do for government officials. And the third is essentially development of their own small bits of software which they also make open source, such as some software for weaving, some software for GIS mapping, etc., etc. So none of the implementation is actually from these centers linking into a coherent execution of the existing policies which have been made in 2015. So both from Kerala as well as from the central government, what you notice is that there is good intent, there's a recognition FOSS is important, but there's an absence of execution. And why is that happening quite often is going back to some of the previous talks. There's an absence of an entity which is tasked with the singular focus of promoting FOSS within government at the central level. Something even similar to what the government of Kerala is attempting. So this requires, firstly, an implementation audit of existing FOSS policies. Is it really working? The second is a public consultation and update of existing FOSS policies. And this actually needs to involve the community. In-person consultations in Bangalore and other cities will involve a broader group in making the policy and thereby bring them closer to government. Also, going back to the first point by itself, in terms of an implementation audit of existing FOSS policies, the FOSS policies by themselves, if you look at them closely, provide for revisions within themselves, but they have not been revised. I think it's high time it can be done now. And one thing in addition to that which needs to be done is that there needs to be a singular office created for the implementation of FOSS-based activities. For instance, in terms of procurement, when that question came, the government procures most of, at least the central government, whatever it procures mostly, it's now done through the government e-marketplace, which is called GEM. And there is an absence of any technical flow within GEM by itself, which operationalizes the procurement policies for FOSS, in which there can be specific vendor disclosure, that whether an alternative is possible or not. What is the underlying specification of the technology? And in my own work at Internet Freedom Foundation, when we have looked at some awful tenders, we only look at awful tenders, unfortunately, such as facial recognition systems, there is no mention of FOSS by itself. Fourth, adopt a federal approach, and this is why it's important. I think by just looking at the government of India at the central level, we are not looking at building capacities within the states. And when you can involve states beyond Kerala, tell them that there's an actual tangible benefit from cost of ownership, not being locked in by proprietary systems. There's a better sense that there'll be multiple models which will evolve, which will lead to a greater degree of learning. And this is the need of the hour. But if you want to look even further beyond this, when there is some amount of thinking which is emerging even in the United States, and even their FOSS policies seem to be quite similar to what exists in India at present. Here, Frank Nagel has written a wonderful article at the Brookings Institute. He's a professor at the Harvard Business School, and he says the biggest limit to existing US policies related to FOSS, as they are all focused on the federal government's use of creation of and purchasing of technology for its own systems. No policies are targeted at measuring, investing in, or securing the FOSS ecosystem as a whole or in a direct manner. His understanding comes from viewing FOSS not as software, but as a digital public good. And in a digital society, it's essentially common shared infrastructure. These are the roads, these are the bridges, these are the piping systems which are used by society at large. And given there's an existing market failure, given that there's not a high degree of direct investment which may be flowing directly from the economic benefit from FOSS-based technologies such as the Apache server, there may be a need for government to also directly invest into these technologies. Some of these proposals are persuasive. For instance, creation of a centralized office, and these are all with respect to the United States. Creation of a centralized office to oversee the government's FOSS-related activities, continuous need to measure and understand the FOSS ecosystem. Why? Because we do not know the economic value of FOSS and what it plays in India. And it's very difficult to measure as well, as he states. It's not like a pure product which has a price, input costs, and then essentially whatever is the revenue which is derived from it. But there are methodologies that exist for it. So when the benefit becomes visible and is quantified, for instance, in our own national economic survey, there will be a greater focus in budgetary outlays by governments themselves in investing in this kind of digital public infrastructure. The third is the facilitation of avenues for direct market investment in FOSS to increase R&D funding, training, providing tax credits for FOSS contributions. Now, if you look at providing tax credits for FOSS contributions, in the US context, he says that a certain degree of a tax write-off may be made available to a developer or to a person who's investing their own money into maintaining a FOSS project. What can that be? Possibly server costs. Of course, in India, as I run a non-profit as well, an ATG 12A gives you a 50% tax write-off up to your permissible limits if you donate to our organization. Similarly, if you do believe that contribution towards FOSS is contribution towards digital public infrastructure, a tax credit or a write-off may be, theoretically at least, plausible. 4, methods for securing an existing and future FOSS deployments, and most of these suggestions which he does make stem from his understanding of the log4j vulnerability, which he documents in this paper. Thank you so much. I'll leave some space for 1 or 2 questions, but this is a longer paper. It may be not provocative or may have those talking points, but it has some footnotes. And I look forward to also looking at the annual reports of MITI for the next few following years. With that, I'll end, but with the ask, I'm outside in the community booth, and my colleague Ashlesh is also there. You can become an IFF member and donate to us on a monthly basis. And you can also help us build our website if you just want to volunteer your skills and time. We've had about 6 or 7 signups, so it'll be a fun project for you to actually help us do our work in a much more effective way. Thank you so much for having me here.